Hello and welcome to EdSpace, the show that strives to bring you clarity on the week's economic issues. Joining me in the studio today is Sukumar Ranganathan. Thanks, Sukumar, for being on the show. So let me start first of all with the CAG report. What were some of the most profound findings for you of the CAG report?
See, the interesting thing is none of the findings were profound because they were all expected. It was fairly well known that there were significant irregularities in allotment of coal mines for captive mining purposes. But this is not a new thing. This is how coal and other resources have typically been allotted in India. There has been no transparent process. I don't know whether an auction or bidding is the right way to go about it, because there are a lot of studies that show that it's not the most effective way of allotting a resource which has a significant bearing on a lot of people, like spectrum or coal, which has a bearing on the power industry. But what the CAG's report highlighted were the specifics, right? Because you had names of companies, you had instances of a company which hadn't really qualified suddenly coming in and being allotted a mine or something of that sort. And those are the interesting things to my mind. But quite honestly, none of the findings were profound because this was expected. And the numbers, there are a million ways in which you can calculate numbers. So I don't think we should focus on the number. Everyone's getting carried away by the number because these numbers will obviously be huge, because these are presumptive numbers. You're using some extrapolation equation to get to these numbers. So don't look at the number. I think what's significant is the process. We all knew the process was flawed. I think what CAG has done is to point to the specifics of the mistakes that were there.
Okay, so now when it talks about resource allocation, it's probably rightly said that there should be competitive bidding. But if we look at global benchmark and practices, usually there is an annual lease instead of an auctioning and giving a lump sum. Why do you think India does not follow this practice, and should it?
This is something that needs to be studied, right? I think the genesis of this whole thing has to do with the nationalization of coal mining in this country. And after that was done, and during the license Raj, when a little bit of reforms was sought to be achieved, and a very different kind of reforms also, the government said, is there any way in which we can allot mines to private companies? And which is why this whole process came about. So I think you'll have to go back and understand the history behind this whole thing. But going forward, if you have to find a proper way of allotting resources, you'll have to be very clear about your objectives, right? For instance, in the case of spectrum, what's your objective? In 2000, I think the objective was to achieve a higher teledensity. It wasn't focused on maximizing the returns to the government. In 2012, the objectives may be different. But I think whatever the objective is, it needs to have a strong focus on people, right? Not on industry, not on government, but on people. How does it affect common people? And I think the benefits that come to the government by auctioning a resource, if that is the formula, that is the method it chooses to adopt, should in some way be transferred to the people. Right now, there are a million ways in which you can do this. You can use this as a good way to offset your subsidies that you have in many cases, but you'll have to think about it. I don't even think they're thinking along those lines. So we'll have to wait and see.
What about surplus coal? Talking about Reliance Power, it's in the eye of the CAG report only because it's diverted the surplus coal from the allotted captive mines. Now, do you think we should let the surplus coal be used by CIL alone, or there should be any other process of actually diverting surplus coal?
Again, it depends on the policy, right? I think if you look at coal, the fundamental policy is so wrong that I think at each instance, I don't want to go into specifics, but it's actually possible to pick every section of the policy that they have and find flaws in it. In this case, the first issue has to do with the fact that The only way you can give a coal mine to a power company is through captive allotment. Now, captive allotment obviously means you have to use it only for that purpose. Now, if the mine produces more coal, what happens to it? Does that company get to use it? Does that company get to use it for some other plant? Does that company get to trade in it? Now, these are issues that need to be answered systemically, right? You can't do it every time there's an issue. You'll have to answer it systemically. And again, my suggestion would be, look at the bigger picture. What are your ultimate objectives? Your ultimate objective is to increase power production in this country. Is to ensure that people do not have to pay too much for power, because obviously no one wants to pay too much for power, right? You or I also don't want to pay too much for power. We should pay market rates, but not a huge rate. And to ensure that the company which is given this right to mine captive coal, because you must understand that it's a discretionary allocation, right? It's not something that the company gets by right. The company gets it because it is doing something else. In this case, the company gets it because it's generating power. I don't know how proper it is to allow that company to profit from that in another venture, right? Just looking at the logic behind it. So unfortunately, the policy is silent on all these issues. You will have to, and every time you have a policy question, you can't be running back to a group of ministers or something else, which is what we typically do in this country, right? You set up either a group of ministers or you set up an empowered group of ministers and you try to find an answer. I think you need a proper coal policy, a proper coal allocation policy, proper resource allocation policy, proper resource pricing policy, and then you can go out and make whatever modifications you want, but you'll have to start from there.
Also, coal production has been largely state-owned. Let's just single out Coal India Limited for that matter, and very few independent mining companies are actually brought in. Now, the reason that they say is that the energy prices are much lower. How true or untrue is this, and do you agree we should continue this practice?
I think one of the big issues is Coal India, really. Productivity is down. It's another complaint that many people voice against Coal India. But you create a monolith, you will have to reap the sins of creating a monolith, and one of those is lower productivity. The other one of that, the other issue is inflexible market pricing. Now, this inflexibility works both ways, right? Sometimes prices are kept artificially low, sometimes prices are kept artificially high. So those are all issues that will come up. But again, what are your plans for the sector? How are you going to reform it? That's the big issue.
So I think you're referring to politics and policy making, and let's look at the political implications of this. It's not really fair on BJP's part to be interrupting parliamentary committee. And having said that, how much blame do you think the current government should take for the findings of the CAG report, or do you think we should not really single out governments?
No, I think it's not a question of singling out or not singling out. I'm a big believer in responsibility, right? If someone makes a mistake, that person has to pay for it. Now, the way things work in organizations, the way things work in newsrooms is that, for instance, is typically if there's a mistake, then the blame rests with the editor, right? The buck stops with the editor. In the government, who does it stop with? It stops with the Prime Minister. Now, in this case, the Prime Minister is also the person who was handling the coal portfolio at the time these mines were allotted. So I think he's not even one step removed from it. He's directly involved in it. So I'm not for a minute suggesting that he benefited in some way from this whole thing. But all I'm saying is that as coal minister, he has to take responsibility for this.